Sirens howled in the distance, echoing between the old buildings of downtown Ottawa. A crowd of people rushed out of the St. Laurent Bank building, most of them panting, their eyes wide with panic. Some stumbled on the sidewalk, desperate to get away from the growing chaos behind them. Thick, black smoke poured from the gap under the bank's main doors. It grew heavier, darker, harder to breathe. An old woman screamed, clutching her purse as if it were the only thing she had left. A middle-aged man in a gray suit shouted toward the newly arrived officers. There was a small explosion. We smelled chemicals. "My son is still inside," he cried. One of the bank security guards, still dazed, spoke with a trembling voice. I saw a metal suitcase thrown into the waiting area. Right after that, the smoke started, and I heard ticking. Police officers quickly surrounded the area with yellow tape. Firefighters approached with caution, but the air was thick and poisonous. One of them tried to go in and was forced to retreat, coughing violently. A uniformed officer gripped his radio tightly and spoke fast. "Possible explosive device. Bomb squad is en route." In the middle of this chaos, a little girl tugged at her mother's coat and whimpered, "Mama, Billy's still inside?" "He didn't come out. He's still in the waiting room." The woman collapsed to her knees. She leaned against a street lamp, covering her mouth. The bystanders looked at one another, helpless. No one dared to go back inside. Then, from across the street, someone began to walk forward. His steps were slow, steady. His frame was thin. He wore a faded military jacket with old, peeling patches. A rusty dog tag hung from his chest, swaying gently with the wind. His face was weathered with age. A long scar marked his left temple. His worn-out cap read Canadian Forces, tilted low to shade his eyes. He stopped at the police line, eyes fixed on the bank entrance. He wasn't blinking. He didn't tremble. It was as if he had seen this before. As if he had walked through this kind of hell once already. "Sir, do not cross that line," a young officer shouted. "It's a danger zone. We don't know what type of explosive is in there." The man looked at him, just for a second, then back at the smoke. "I'm going in," he said, and without waiting for approval, he stepped past the yellow line. He walked straight into the smoke, up the cracked marble stairs of the bank. The crowd went silent. "Who is that?" someone whispered. The firefighters stood frozen. A local news cameraman had just arrived but forgot to hit record. In that thick silence, time seemed to slow. An old man, one whose body was no longer young, walked into a building that could explode at any moment. Not for glory, not for medals, but for one child he'd never met. And no one yet knew that what would happen next would stun an entire nation. The smoke clung to everything inside the bank, thick like oil and just as suffocating. Each breath felt heavier than the last, filled with traces of metal and burnt plastic. The dim red light from the emergency bulbs barely illuminated the ruined interior. The veteran moved carefully, one hand brushing the wall, the other shielding his nose with damp cloth taken from his coat pocket. His boots stepped over broken glass and scattered folders. Somewhere in the distance, he could still hear that steady ticking. Tick, tick, tick. But it wasn't just the sound of a bomb. To him, it sounded like a memory, a heartbeat from long ago, a sound that once meant life or death. His name was Richard Clive, former sergeant, Canadian Forces, stationed in Kandahar, retired in silence. Most in the city knew him only as a quiet old man who fed pigeons near the fountain in Confederation Park. No one knew what he had been through. No one knew what he carried inside. And even now, no one recognized the man inside the burning bank. He passed the shattered reception desk and crouched beside an overturned table. Blood, just a little, still fresh. He followed it carefully until he reached the main lobby. There, the waiting area had turned into a war zone. Chairs thrown across the room. Ceiling tiles collapsed. A metal suitcase sat half buried beneath a layer of soot, its surface blinking red. But what made Richard freeze wasn't the bomb. It was the soft sound of coughing, coming from behind the far end of the room. He moved faster, the limp in his legs slowing him only slightly. Around the corner, beneath a collapsed beam and an old leather couch, was a little boy, about 6 years old. curled up into himself, face covered in ash. His small fingers were tightly gripping a worn-out stuffed dog. His name was Billy. Richard knelt down. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly. "I'm here now." The boy looked up, eyes wide with fear. "But somehow," he nodded. Richard lifted the couch with both arms, his muscles straining, his breath trembling. Pain shot up through his shoulder, the one that never fully healed. But he held it, just enough to free the boy. Billy didn't cry, not a single tear. He simply crawled out and clung to Richard's chest, his tiny arms wrapped tight around the old jacket. The ticking sound grew louder. Richard turned to look at the suitcase. The countdown display was now visible through the smoke. 1 minute and 37 seconds. He didn't have time to think. He needed to get the boy out. But he also knew if he made one wrong move, if he brushed the wrong wire, this building wouldn't just collapse. It would vanish. Tick, tick, tick. He tightened his grip around the child and whispered, "You're going to be okay. I promise." He had no idea how he was going to keep that promise. Not yet, but he would, because this time he wouldn't fail. Richard pushed forward, carrying the boy gently in his arms. The smoke was thicker now. It stung his eyes, burned his lungs, and blurred the hallways into a maze of shadows and firelight. The ticking sound was louder, no longer distant. It felt as if the bomb was pulsing with its own heartbeat. He reached the front of the lobby, but something made him stop. A faint red light blinked just above the exit door. He squinted. Tripwire, barely visible, stretched ankle-high, connecting to a secondary panel hidden behind a trash bin. The suitcase, it wasn't the only device. Richard stepped back. His instincts took over. His eyes scanned the room for alternate exits, for weaknesses in the walls, for anything that resembled an opening. But the fire had spread quickly. Most escape paths were sealed by fallen beams or swallowed in flames. He looked down at Billy. The boy's breathing was fast and shallow, but he hadn't spoken a word since being rescued. Still gripping the stuffed dog, still clinging to Richard's chest. He remembered a vent, back near the corner of the waiting area. An old maintenance ducked behind a customer service counter. It wasn't made for adults, but maybe, just maybe, the boy could fit. Richard turned around and hurried back, ignoring the growing ache in his leg. The heat clawed at his skin as he approached the corner. There it was, a low, square opening with a metal grate half broken from the earlier shockwave. He knelt and pried it open further. Dust and soot poured out. Then he whispered to the boy, "I need you to be brave again, all right? I'm going to put you in here. You'll crawl straight until you see a grate with light. That's where the police are. They'll find you." Billy looked at him, tears finally forming in his eyes. "Are you coming too?" Richard forced a smile. "Of course. I'll be right behind you." It was a lie. He already knew. If he left the bomb unattended, someone else would trigger the tripwire. If the suitcase was rigged with remote pressure sensors, it might even detonate the moment the child escaped without someone maintaining balance on the floor tiles. He had to stay. Just long enough. He helped the boy into the vent, inch by inch, guiding him gently. "Keep going. Don't stop. You're doing great." The ticking filled the room. 1 minute and 2 seconds. Once Billy disappeared into the darkness, Richard took a deep breath. He turned back toward the suitcase. The blinking red light had changed pattern. Faster now. More urgent. Something was wrong. He stepped carefully, counting each tile, feeling for pressure changes. One tile shifted slightly beneath his boot, just enough to confirm his fear. Pressure trigger. Removing the suitcase wouldn't stop the timer. It might even speed it up. It was a dead man switch. Someone had planned this. Someone wanted it to blow no matter what. But Richard had seen worse, and he had stopped worse. He sat down slowly beside the bomb, close enough to inspect the wires. His mind raced through memories from 2 decades ago. The Kandahar compound, the rigged supply crates, the torn faces of the men he couldn't save. He wouldn't let it happen again. Not here. Not to a boy named Billy. Tick, tick, tick. Time was running out. But Richard Clive wasn't running anymore. He was staying, because somewhere above him, a child was crawling toward the light. And that was worth everything. Outside the bank, the tension was unbearable. Police officers formed a perimeter, radios crackling with updates that held no good news. Firefighters stood ready, hoses aimed but unused. The crowd had grown, passers-by, reporters, city workers, all frozen by the unfolding nightmare. No one had seen the veteran come back out. A paramedic whispered to a nearby officer, "What's he doing in there?" He should have come out by now. The officer didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the front entrance, hoping somehow to see a figure emerge from the smoke. Then, without warning, a faint metallic thud echoed from inside the building. Just once, everyone turned. From beneath a broken vent just behind the side wall of the bank, a small pair of hands pushed through. "Over here," someone shouted. 2 officers and a firefighter rushed to the wall, prying the metal apart. From within the shaft, a boy's voice trembled. "Help! Help!" Tiny arms reached out, clutching a soot-covered stuffed dog. They pulled him out gently. Billy gasped, blinking in the daylight, face streaked with ashen tears. His mother screamed from across the crowd. "Billy!" She broke through the line, collapsed onto her knees, and wrapped her arms around him. "He's alive," whispered one of the officers. But the relief lasted only a moment, because Billy looked up, still holding the stuffed dog, and asked in a small, trembling voice, "Where's the soldier?" Everyone froze again. The soldier had not followed. The bomb was still active. Inside the bank, Richard Clive was sitting still, just a few feet from the suitcase. The blinking red light was now strobing with alarming speed. The display showed 37 seconds. Richard's fingers moved with precision. He had found the primary circuit beneath a metal panel, protected by layers of heat-proof plastic and twisted wires. Whoever built this device was not an amateur. It was rigged to punish anyone who tried to stop it. He didn't need to disarm it entirely. He just needed to interrupt the circuit. Long enough for the specialist to arrive. But he had no tools, no gloves, only his hands, his instincts, and his past. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thin metal dog tag, his own, the one that had survived 2 tours of war, the one he never took off. He bent it slightly, shaped it with his hands, and carefully wedged it between 2 contact points. Tick, 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 23 seconds. He could hear something now, voices through the walls. Someone shouting his name, but he didn't move. He pressed his hand over the tag, using the heat from his palm to hold it in place. 18 seconds. His vision blurred. The smoke had finally reached his limit. His lungs burned. His knees trembled. 13 seconds. He thought of the boy. He thought of the men he'd lost. He thought of the day he walked off the battlefield and decided to disappear. And now, somehow, everything he ever regretted had brought him back here, back to this one final moment. Outside, the bomb squad had arrived. They rushed in, gas masks on, boots pounding against the concrete. Their leader barked orders as they approached the lobby, but as they turned the corner, they stopped. One of them gasped. The veteran was there, still on the floor, palm pressed against the blinking suitcase. And next to his hand, wedged tight with surgical precision, a single bent dog tag, wedged between the live wires, holding everything in place. The timer had frozen at 5 seconds. The room was still. The smoke, the blinking light, the frozen display. Everything hung in the air like a breath not yet exhaled. The lead bomb technician didn't speak at first. He crouched slowly beside the veteran, examining the improvised wedge holding the circuit apart. His gloved hands moved carefully. His breath caught somewhere between awe and fear. "Don't touch it," whispered one of his team. But Richard didn't flinch. Even with the full weight of the moment pressing against him, he remained motionless. His eyes were open but distant. His chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. His palms still pressed firm against the tag. The technician reached for his radio. "This is Squad Leader Bravo. We have a live device. Manual interruption is in place." Civilian intervened using a dog tag. I repeat, a dog tag. There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end responded. "Is the circuit stable?" A beat of silence. Then, for now, Outside, tension rippled through the crowd again. Reporters were broadcasting live now, the footage shaky but powerful. A child had just been pulled from the smoke. The bomb squad had entered, and inside a veteran was holding death at bay with nothing but memory, courage, and steel. The mayor of Ottawa had arrived, watching in disbelief. Paramedics stood ready. Firefighters gripped their hoses but didn't move. Everyone waited for the final word. Back inside, the technician signaled his team. "We need to lift his hand." "No," said Richard weakly. The tech leaned closer. "Sir, we're here now. Let us take it from here." Richard blinked slowly. His voice cracked through the dryness in his throat. "I move, it blows." His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The technician stared at the timer. Still 5 seconds. Still blinking. Then he realized Richard wasn't just interrupting the circuit. He was the circuit. His hand, his weight, his body heat had stabilized the trigger. He was the only thing keeping the contacts apart. If they moved him now, if the tag shifted even slightly, the bomb would complete its final cycle and explode. "We have to defuse it around him," the squad leader said grimly. "Right here, right now." They brought in their tools, spread them on the floor in a careful arc. The floor tiles creaked as they knelt beside the suitcase. Wires were labeled, small clamps placed gently against contact points. It was a dance of absolute silence, broken only by coughs and soft instructions through radio headsets. Richard didn't move, didn't speak, didn't ask how long it would take. He just kept his palm in place. The same way he once steadied his rifle across the broken ridge of Kabul. The same way he once steadied a comrade's bleeding body in the sand, whispering that help was coming. Now, he was the only thing between a bomb and a city, and still, no one watching from outside could even guess what was happening inside. Not yet. Tick, tick, tick. It took 11 minutes and 39 seconds. Then suddenly, the blinking stopped. The light turned dark. The room exhaled. A breath returned to everyone's lungs. The technician looked at Richard. "It's done. You can let go now." But Richard didn't answer. His eyes were still open, still fixed on the space in front of him, still holding that final position. The technician reached out slowly, touched his shoulder, and whispered, "Sir?" No response. He placed 2 fingers to the side of Richard's neck. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "He's unconscious. Get the medics. Now." The front doors burst open. 2 paramedics sprinted inside with stretchers. The team lifted Richard with care, still holding his hand gently as if afraid the bomb might return to life if they let go too fast. The city watched in silence as the stretcher emerged from the smoke. And for one moment, the chaos of sirens, reporters, and flashing lights stopped completely, because lying there, covered in ash, lips slightly blue, chest rising only with effort, was a man the world had forgotten. But not anymore. The ambulance raced through the city streets, sirens wailing through the evening light. Inside, the paramedics worked fast, oxygen mask-fitted, for lines connected, vital signs tracked by the second. Richard Clive lay unconscious, but his grip on the edge of the stretcher, even in his condition, was tight, as if even in sleep, he wasn't quite ready to let go. Outside, news of the bank incident exploded across the nation. Veteran saves child from bomb. Unarmed man prevents explosion with bare hands. Ottawa nearly suffers tragedy. One soldier stops it. His name, unknown to most only hours ago, now flashed across television screens and social media feeds. Richard Clive, 62 years old, former sergeant, Canadian Forces, survivor of Kandahar. Many were shocked to discover the truth, that Richard had once received a Medal of Bravery, only to disappear from public life after a paperwork scandal had stripped him of his pension and recognition. He had chosen silence over bitterness, isolation over protest, until today. At the hospital, nurses moved carefully around his room. Machines beeped gently. A steady rhythm returned to his chest. The little boy, Billy, stood at the door holding his mother's hand, the stuffed dog still in his arms. He looked up at the sleeping man with wide eyes. "Can I go in?" he asked. His mother hesitated, then nodded. Billy stepped softly into the room, the weight of everything he had seen pressing into his tiny shoulders. He climbed up the edge of the hospital chair and placed the stuffed dog gently on the veteran's chest. The nurse smiled faintly. "He hasn't woken up yet." Billy didn't answer. He just whispered. He kept his promise. Later that night, as the sun set behind the hospital windows, government officials arrived. The Minister of Veterans Affairs came in person. So did the mayor. So did the commanding officer of the bomb squad, still wearing part of his gear. They stood by the bed in silence. Then one by one, they placed something at his bedside. A new medal, a reinstatement letter, a small Canadian flag, folded with care. But none of them noticed what lay on the table beside the bed. A single dog tag, bent slightly in the center, still warm to the touch, still marked with a name that the world had once forgotten. In the days that followed, the footage of the event went viral. Interviews were held. News anchors wept on air. People came to the hospital gates, holding handmade signs. One of them simply read, "He didn't need a uniform to be our hero." But inside room 214 of St. Joseph Hospital, away from all the cameras and attention, Richard Clive finally opened his eyes. He looked to his left and saw the stuffed dog sitting quietly on his chest. He smiled, not for the cameras, not for the awards, but because a promise had been kept. And for a moment, in a world full of noise, silence felt like victory. 3 days had passed since the incident. The news coverage had not slowed. Networks from other countries began reporting what happened in Ottawa, how a single veteran entered a smoke-filled building moments before a bomb was set to explode and save not only a child, but potentially dozens of lives. Despite the media storm, the hospital room remained quiet. No press was allowed near Richard. The doctors had insisted on rest, and the staff honored it. Security personnel kept watch by the elevators. Flowers, cards, and folded letters arrived from across the country. But Richard asked for none of it. He simply sat by the window, wrapped in a hospital blanket, staring at the sky that looked a little more peaceful than usual. That afternoon, someone knocked softly on the door. Before Richard could respond, the door opened and a tall young woman stepped inside, straight-backed, sharp-eyed, in a navy blue uniform, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. She introduced herself gently. "My name is Officer Lane. I'm here on behalf of the Prime Minister's office." Richard didn't speak. She smiled anyway. "They asked me to tell you this in person, sir. You've been fully reinstated. Rank, pension, commendations, everything that was taken. It's being returned." Still, Richard said nothing. He looked down at his hands, scarred, worn, motionless on the blanket. She walked further into the room and placed a small velvet box on the table beside him. Inside, a medal, shining, untouched, the Cross of Valor, she said. "It's the highest we can give, and it still doesn't feel enough." She hesitated, then pulled a small envelope from her jacket. "There's something else." She handed it to him and took a respectful step back. Richard opened it slowly. Inside was a printed photo. It showed him, covered in soot, barely conscious, lying on the stretcher as paramedics wheeled him through the broken doors of the bank. But what struck him wasn't the image. It was what was written at the bottom. "Because of you, he came home." Attached to the corner was a hand-drawn picture, a child's crayon drawing, a stick figure man with a scar on his face, holding hands with a boy and a dog. Richard exhaled slowly. His fingers trembled slightly as he folded the note. "I didn't do it for this," he murmured. "I know," Officer Lane replied. "That's why it matters." That evening, Richard requested to leave his room and sit by the hospital garden. With help, he was wheeled out to a bench beneath a wide, quiet maple tree. The wind was soft. Birds chirped from high branches. And for once, there was no crowd, no cameras, just peace. Until a small voice called out from the sidewalk, "Mr. Richard." Billy ran forward, his mother following a few steps behind. The boy was wearing a red scarf, and in his hands, a paper-wrapped sandwich. "I brought you peanut butter," he said proudly. Richard chuckled, a low, rusty sound, but it was real. Billy climbed onto the bench beside him. "You're my favorite soldier," he whispered. Richard looked at him with eyes that had seen decades of war. "Not a soldier anymore." Billy shook his head. "You are to me." And for the first time in years, Richard Clive believed it too, not because of a uniform, but because, even in the darkest room, a single act of courage had brought someone back into the light. 1 week after the explosion, a quiet ceremony was held on Parliament Hill. It was not a press event. There were no live broadcasts, no flashing cameras, just an invitation-only gathering of officials, veterans, and families. Richard Clive stood at the center of the stone platform, dressed in a newly issued formal uniform. The colors were crisp, the metals polished. His stance was steady, though the limp in his leg remained. Beside him stood Officer Lane, and just behind her little Billy, dressed in a blue jacket and black shoes that still looked too big for his feet. The Prime Minister approached with a steady stride and offered a firm salute. "We are gathered not only to honor a hero," he said, voice echoing across the quiet crowd, "but to acknowledge what was forgotten, what was owed, and what is now returned." He placed the Cross of Valor on Richard's chest with careful hands. "Your bravery stopped a disaster. But more than that, you reminded us what courage truly means." Richard gave a nod. Not a speech, not a single word, just a nod. It was all that needed to be said. Later, at the reception, Richard sat alone at a table near the edge of the courtyard. He held a cup of black coffee. No sugar, no cream, the way he always drank it. Billy ran up, holding something wrapped in paper. "You forgot this," he said. Richard opened it carefully. Inside was a drawing, a new one. This time it showed him in his uniform, standing tall beside Billy, with the sun overhead and a crowd of smiling stick figures behind them. In the corner, written in uneven handwriting, "Thank you for being brave." Richard smiled faintly. He folded the paper, slipped it into his coat pocket, and tapped it twice with his fingers. "I won't forget," he said. That evening, as the sky turned golden over the Ottawa River, Richard returned to the park bench beneath the maple tree. The city had returned to normal. The broken bank was now boarded up, and plans for a memorial had already been approved. People walked past him, some recognizing him, most not. And that was fine. He didn't need applause. He didn't need headlines. All he needed was that moment, knowing a boy had lived, a bomb had failed, and for once, the scars on his body had meant something more than pain. They had meant purpose. He looked up to the sky, then closed his eyes, and breathed. Days turned into weeks. The world moved on, as it always does. Other news filled the headlines. New emergencies, new stories, new names in bold type. But in a quiet neighborhood just outside Ottawa, the old soldier found peace not in attention, but in simplicity. Richard Clive now lived in a small government-assigned home, a modest one-story brick house with a maple tree in front and a small wooden bench on the porch. The pension had been restored, his name cleared, his honors reinstated. Yet every morning he still woke at dawn. He folded his bed the military way. He brewed a single cup of black coffee. He stepped outside and sat quietly on the porch, watching the sun rise over the rooftops, never expecting anything more from the day than stillness. Until, some mornings, a soft knock came at the gate. Billy, sometimes with a peanut butter sandwich, sometimes just to sit. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Sometimes they just watched the wind move the leaves, listened to birds overhead, and sat in a silence that said everything. Richard never boasted about what he had done. He never told his story unless asked. When local journalists offered to interview him again, he declined politely. He had said what he needed to say. By doing, but still people came by. A fellow veteran who had once served under his command brought his grandson. A teacher brought a classroom of children to leave paper cranes on the gate. One afternoon, a young firefighter visited. He'd been outside the bank that day. He stood silently in front of Richard, then offered a salute. Richard nodded once. That was enough. On his porch wall, beside the flag, hung a single frame. Inside it, the crayon drawing from Billy, faded a little now, but still bright enough to catch the sun in the mornings. Underneath it, he had placed a note, written in pen. It read, "I didn't save a city. I just kept a promise." That night, as the wind picked up and the leaves rustled like whispers, Richard stood beneath the maple tree again. He looked up at the stars, not counting them, not chasing memories, just standing, alive. Still, it was a quiet Thursday morning. Clouds drifted over the city, soft and low, like they had forgotten how to rain. The streets of Ottawa moved in rhythm, buses, bikes, pedestrians, all flowing past the echoes of what once happened. The bank building on St. Laurent Street had been demolished. In its place, a small marble plaza was being constructed, with a garden in the center and a steel plaque already mounted. It read, "In honor of those who stand when others run." Richard Clive, veteran, citizen, protector. People passed it every day. Some paused, some didn't, but all of them walked in peace because of what had once happened there. In his home, just 3 blocks away, Richard Clive sat on his porch as usual. Billy had just left for school, waving from the end of the sidewalk. Richard waved back. Then he stood. He walked inside and took the velvet metal box from his shelf. He placed it gently into a drawer beside his old dog tag, still bent, still burned along one edge. He didn't need to see it every day. It was enough to know it was there. He reached for his jacket, the same jacket he wore the day he walked into the burning bank. He held it for a moment. Then slowly, he put it on. That afternoon, Richard visited the nearly finished Memorial Plaza. He walked along the stones, ran his fingers across the edges of the plaque. A nearby construction worker spotted him and nodded. "Hey, you're him, aren't you?" Richard smiled faintly. "Not today." The worker laughed. "You always were." They shared a quiet look. Then Richard stepped back, watching as the last patch of garden soil was placed down over the earth. "Want to press the button?" The worker offered. "We got the last timer here. Counts down 5 seconds. When it hits 0, the water fountain starts." Richard looked at the small silver button beside the base of the new fountain. He chuckled under his breath. 5 seconds, he whispered. He pressed the button. Beep, 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 beep. Then, FWSH, the fountain erupted in a clear arc of water, shimmering under the pale sun. Children nearby clapped. The plaza lit up with life. But Richard didn't linger. He simply nodded once more and walked away. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, he sat beneath his maple tree again. Billy was drawing with chalk on the sidewalk. The breeze was calm, the silence steady, and Richard Clive, once forgotten, once wounded, once buried under memories of fire and regret, closed his eyes and smiled, because in the end, the last countdown he ever heard didn't end in an explosion. It ended in peace.